Okay, so I think we'll get started. We'll have some other people joining as we go. So first of all, welcome everyone to another in our series of public events hosted by the Economic History Department at LSE. And while I think all of us are probably quite tired of Zoom, one of the advantages is that it allows us to bring people together who aren't all in the same place. But we certainly do hope to be able to be doing these events in person soon, not least of which to be able to gather after the event together, which is something that we've lost for the last year or so. So my name is Peter Cirenza, and I've had the great pleasure of doing my PhD and teaching and advising in the Economic History Department at LSE for more than a decade now. And I chair the department's advisory board. And with my other hat, I also am involved with various operations at TKO Capital, which is a global alternative asset management firm. And I'm very happy to be the chair for today's event. So migration is a timeless subject in human experience. And as always, including at present, it's a critical issue in many regions of the world. So with our panel today, we're hoping to shed some light on immigrant experience upon arrival in their new societies. And we're going to think about how well they've integrated, what impacts they've had on their destination countries, what are the policy implications of these impacts, what further research might be helpful. And we thought it would be useful to bring together the historical perspective and analytical rigor of economic historians such as Chris and Alex. So Chris Minns is professor and deputy head for research in the Economic History Department at the LSE. His research focuses on migration and economic mobility in the past. He has had publications in a range of really impressive journals, including the Journal of Economic History, Explorations in Economic History, the European Review of Economic History, and the Economic History Review. And Chris and I also have quite a long-standing personal connection in that I was his first PhD candidate when he joined the faculty at the LSE. And so I hope he's chosen wiser in future. Alex Nowrasteh is a director of immigration studies at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. His work has appeared in major publications in the United States, and his peer-reviewed academic publications have appeared in journals including the World Bank Economic Review, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, and Public Choice. He has co-authored 2 books, most recently Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, with co-author Benjamin Powell. And this is a pioneering work on how economic institutions in receiving countries adjust to immigration. And he also has a connection to the Economic History Department, having completed an MSc degree back in 2011. And Tracy didn't remember him, which probably meant he was a very good student. So we're quite happy about that as well. The Economic History Department is perhaps the global leader in its field, being quite modest about it, combining social science concepts, techniques, and the rigorous use of evidence to better understand the development of economies and societies. And as my dear friend Dudley Baines once told me, it's just a really good way to study history. The Economic History Advisory Board, the sponsor of today's event, was established in 2018 to assist the department in promoting its activities, including through events such as this. The board seeks to engage with alumni and friends of the department and in helping to develop resources to support, in particular, the very vibrant PhD community. And Professor Max Schultz, who is with us today, was very much the driving force behind the establishment of the board. And it gives me great pride to say that that the Economic History Advisory Board will be funding its first PhD studentship in this coming academic year, with the goal of being able to fund a new candidate each year. And if anyone on the call would like more information about the department or the advisory board, feel free to be in touch with me or with any member of the advisory board, several of whom I see on the call today. So just quickly on logistics, we would welcome questions throughout the presentation, and we would request that people use what we all are quite familiar with by now, use the chat function in Zoom to share those questions. And after the initial panel discussion with Chris and Alex, we'll then spend the second half of the session taking questions from the audience. So I hope that's all clear. And so we're going to start with a question on immigrant integration. And have immigrants generally integrated rapidly in destination economies, both in terms of labor markets and in other aspects? Are there big differences in the experience of different immigrant groups between destinations and over time? And Chris, I thought I would let you start with that, and then Alex can come on afterwards.
Thanks, Pete. No pressure. So first, thanks for the invitation to do this, to Alex for coming over, as it were, to participate in the panel. And it's nice to see some faces I haven't seen for a while here. Maybe we can catch up a bit after. So I guess for me, the easiest way to think about this is, do immigrants move up the job ladder in the destinations they arrive in? Okay. And as a historian, I've mostly thought about this question in like the early 20th century context, where the answer is yes. Okay. Job ladders are a good way to think about this, because for historical migration, we often don't know income, but we do know about your job, right? So that comes through pretty clearly in most historical settings, also contemporary ones, right? What changes a bit over time is how that might compare to like non-migrants, right? So the position of your comparison group of the native born, right? Where we know about income as well as occupation in historical settings, it looks like migrants also have sort of income convergence to the native born. So in terms of integration, if we think of that as sort of the labor market side, that looks quite positive from occupation. There are differences between groups, right? So you do see some groups have a slightly, immigrant groups have a slightly higher, let's say, average position in terms of the kind of job status they have than others. But one thing we also see is that a lot of that washes out when you get to like the second generation. Okay, so you do see like a correlation between how does a immigrant generation do in the labor market and their sons and daughters. But I think that tends to be overwhelmed by the fact that sort of controlling for who your father is, immigrants, the children of immigrants tend to be quite successful, right? So that might tell us something about the type of person who chooses to migrate in the first place. That's something we can maybe come back to a bit later. I also want to say, I've mostly talked about history, right? So I think if you go forward into the 20th century, I'd say roughly speaking, you're going to find the same patterns. I think the historical context is really nice because it's a period that's a bit like a social experiment. There aren't really restrictive immigration policies. If you get on the boat, from Europe at least, okay, get in the boat and go to America, you could do it, right? So I think it gives you a good sense about what type of person chooses to migrate, and without sort of policy filters and so forth, what the outcomes are. Now, if you're coming from Asia in the 19th century, it's a little bit different. That's also something we maybe could come back to later, right? But for Europeans, I think it's a really nice sort of, what would happen with open borders today? Well, maybe thinking about the European experience in America might give us some clues.
Yeah, and a lot of that evidence has really come forward to today. What we do when we take a look at in the United States, for instance, the last, since basically 1995 to the present, controlling for things like age of arrival, how long you've been in the United States working, your sex, education, etc. It generally, there's general wage convergence within about 20 years. Now, this is different for different groups, and one of the groups it's a little different for is for unauthorized or illegal immigrants in the United States. And that's partly because it is unlawful to employ an illegal immigrant in the United States since about 1986. So as a result of that, and there are some fines and enforcement of that. So as a result, from an employer's perspective, they pay illegal immigrants a little bit less than they otherwise would to compensate themselves for the risk, the legal risk of hiring these individuals. But what's remarkable is taking a look at the wage convergence between unlawful immigrants and natives, or unlawful immigrants and legal immigrants, beginning in about 2015 or so. Once they arrive in the United States, the wage difference is actually very small. We're talking about sort of the low single digits, around 3%, compared to comparative natives or comparative legal immigrants. And part of the reason why that is probably just a big slowdown in enforcement of some of these interior immigration laws in the United States, and the legalization through sort of temporary work permits given out by the Obama administration. So what we've seen is, this general pattern that Chris describes has continued, at least in the United States, into the present day.
Can I add one more thing, Pete?
Yes, please do. I was going to ask you.
Okay. So one thing we were talking about before is, how do we think about integration versus what economists think of as assimilation, right? Which is sort of, in the labor market, everyone ends up doing the same thing. So I think one thing that might be nice to talk about a bit is that, like, as immigrants move up job ladders, it's not always, they look more like the profile of non-migrants, but the way they move up isn't always strictly the same, right? So there are still some quite notable differences in the job patterns between immigrants and non-immigrants, as immigrants are sort of progressing, as it were. So in the historical setting, non-migrants are 50% farmers, right? And immigrants to America, some groups go into farming, but most of them don't do so much. And moving into farming isn't part of the sort of integration experience for the foreign born, right? Whereas young American men moving into farming in the 19th century, that's a pretty big feature of the landscape. So moving up, as it were, doesn't always mean looking just like native born. I think that's a nice thing to sort of also put into context, certainly for the historical stuff.
Yeah, that's absolutely right today as well. I mean, there's a lot of geographic segmentation of where migrants move across countries. So you can go to different states in the United States. West Virginia, for instance, foreign-born population is about 1 to 2%. In a place like Texas, it's almost 20% in the United States. So, I mean, you're just going to get, and that doesn't even get to the difference between some areas in the countryside versus a lot of urban areas where there's a lot higher concentration. But there are great exceptions to this in places in the American Midwest, where a lot of farming communities have been declining in population for decades, in some cases about a century, and a lot influx of especially Hispanic and Mexican migrants to places in Kansas and some rural counties and Iowa are now making up between 10 and 20% of the stock population. And they're working primarily in a lot of agricultural occupations, right? So one of the big differences, right, from 100 years ago is I think in agriculture, where you're just seeing a lot more migrant workers in agriculture in the United States versus it being much more of a native-born profession back then. And then another issue, I think that's on top of this, that might be a bit of a bigger issue today, is the extent of licensing for different occupations and sort of legal barriers to entry. So you have this phenomenon, it differs across countries, but you have, say, very highly educated immigrants in their home country who, say, maybe have a medical degree, but due to licensing restrictions, they cannot practice medicine immediately in their destination country, so they're stuck in lower occupations. Lower paid occupations, such as taxi cab drivers. I think we've probably all experienced that anecdote of a migrant from someplace who's very highly educated doing a lower skilled job than he might otherwise do. And the extent to which those licenses affect upward mobility is something that is not as explored, at least in the modern world, as it could be.
Right. And I guess the other thing that strikes me is that certainly in the age of mass migration, right, 19th century into the 20th century, you had a lot of migrants who were farmers in their host countries, who, when they arrived in the U.S., moved, became more urban and were not moving into farming. So almost a bit of the reverse. And as Chris said, more of the the domestic people were in farming or moving into farming in North America.
So on this point, there's a really interesting working paper by Yea and Nay Spitzer and Ariel Zimran, which was presented at our department a few weeks ago. They're sort of trying to understand the networks that got migrants from Europe to America. And so I had this kind of idea in mind that, if you're an Italian migrant, this is a group they look at. You go from farm to city and then from city to the US. And I don't think their results look at all like that. So I think that's as a kind of, going straight from farm to city is what I think the dominant mode, right, for a lot of these migrants in the 19th century, right?
Yeah. Well, good. Well, that's very good. So, why don't we turn to a question now on the impact that immigrants have on the societies in which that they join, and Alex, certainly this has been a focus of your work over recent decades, and so I have a kind of a multi-part question that ties to your book. So hopefully this works. So I think the first step is thinking about what is sort of the nature and the scale of the economic impact of unrestricted immigration. To the extent that you didn't have significant restrictions, which we currently do on migration, what would the economic impact be? And then maybe talk about some of the concerns that have been raised about what the potential other impacts of a large number of foreigners arriving in a new country would be. In particular, concerns that some have raised that they would undermine kind of formal and informal institutions, which support how people interact in society and affect, reduce productivity, et cetera. And really whether you find that is the case or not. And then maybe lastly, if you can also, and Chris, feel free to chime in as well, the concern that high levels of immigration, in particular of lower skilled migrants, what's the impact on job prospects, wages of less skilled native workers?
Well, great. Yeah, that's a lot of questions. So I'll try to answer them in an efficient manner. The general research on what sort of free migration how it would affect global economic output are very high. So just taking a look at the base economic models that estimate that, the starting point is to take a look at the wage difference between identical workers in different countries. And when you compare, say, developing countries' wages to those of, just by example, the United States, sort of an identical worker who has a high school degree, about 10 years of experience, can expect a 4 to 5-fold income increase in his wages, and that's adjusted for purchasing power parity. So it's adjusted for the cost of living. And that is a tremendous increase in wages. And that is due to the fact that they are much more productive in the United States or other developed countries than they are in their current developing countries. And that's because, the marginal value product of labor is so much higher here in the United States. So the demand curve is just much greater for that kind of work. So Michael Clemens, who's a friend of mine at the Center for Global Development, sort of put this into a model, took a look at a number of other estimates of what people have taken a look at, like what would be the effect of sort of a global free immigration system where workers could move from any place in the world to any other place for higher wages, and then take a look at what happens to gross world product as a result of that. And he finds that it's generally a 50 to 150% increase in gross world product. Now that's an annual figure. And taking a look at the size of the global economy, the present value is somewhere around $1 quadrillion. I don't get to use that word quadrillion very much in my work, but it's hard to imagine another single policy intervention that could have potentially such a large output on that. Now, the big concern from this is that model holds American and institutions in the rest of the developed world constant. It assumes that the wealth producing institutions, whether it's the institutions of economic institutions of private property or free contract or representative government, democracy, cultural institutions that help people produce more effectively and become more productive. It assumes that those are held steady. But one of the things we know is that a lot of the reasons why countries are poorer than others is because of differences in these institutions, right? I mean, just go and read like your Doug North, right? Go revisit Doug North, which I did in detail when I was a student at London School of Economics. And so that's kind of probably a pretty important assumption, because these migrants come from countries with generally less productive institutions. So the fear raised by people like George Borjas, who's an economist at Harvard, and Paul Collier at Oxford, and some others, is that, well, if they migrate, they might bring these institutions with them. They might bring these cultural norms with them. And as a result, they could degrade or undermine or worsen the institutions in the developed world. And as a result of that, they could sort of lower economic growth in the long run. So, to sum it up really quickly, there could be they could kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And that, I think, is the best potential counter argument to the free immigration position. So we decided, it began with a blog post in 2014, writing this book, just taking a look at there was a relationship here. And over the course of time, writing several peer-reviewed papers on this topic, we decided to turn it into a book for Cambridge, just analyzing these effects, taking a look at how immigration affects culture, corruption, terrorism, and taking a look at the cross-country impact on economic freedom institutions, which are measured by Fraser and Cato in an index, and then taking a look at several case studies, such as mass quasi-natural experiments of mass migrations to the countries of Jordan in 1991, of Kuwaiti Palestinians forced out by the first Gulf War, of Soviet Jews fleeing the downfall of the Soviet Union, going to Israel, and then the 19th and early 20th century in the United States, to see what the relationship is, to see if these mass surges of immigration actually had an impact on these institutions. And what we found in the case of Jordan and Israel is that these mass migrations, which in the case of Israel increased Israel's population by 20% in less than 5 years. So we're talking about a massive increase in the population. That would be as if 70 million people moved to the US over the course of 5 years. So huge increase. In Jordan is about a 10% increase of the population in 1 year. And what we took a look at, and in both of these situations, these new migrants can vote just like natives due to differences and quirks in their laws. And what we found was that in both of these countries, their economic institutions improved dramatically shortly thereafter. And there's a lot of qualitative evidence, taking a look at the statements by politicians, by bureaucrats, by other people on the ground in these countries, that they did liberalize in large part in response to the migrant surge. So there's a lot of good evidence there. And then we took a look at the 19th century in the United States and early 20th century. The data back then are a lot less good. We can't nearly do the types of experiments or the types of analysis we did with Israel and Jordan, but we found a general sort of pattern over US history where there is sort of this inverse relationship between some of these measures of the quality of institutions and the growth of the immigrant population. So what our general finding is on all of these is that immigrants really either don't affect these productive institutions at all, or they have a positive influence. And part of the way to think about this is that institutions in your home country are methodologically, they're ontologically collective. So like, for instance, me moving to communist Cuba is not going to change your institutions one bit, to use like an extreme example, right? So in this sense, due to founder effects, due to the fact that these institutions are founded by people a long time ago in these countries, they're sticky. So adding more people into the system, there is a sort of assimilation to these values over time. And there doesn't appear to be any kind of situation where the numbers are so large or so extreme through at least voluntary migration that they've been able to really substantially change or overwhelm, degrade these institutions. And there's some evidence that there's even some moderate improvements for different reasons. So that is the sort of elevator pitch of my academic book.
What are some of the improvements in institutions that immigrants have in your work that you found?
So some of the improvements, say, for instance, in Israel and Jordan, where we took a look at this, is that the government commits legally to protect the rights of private property more so than they did before. So for instance, more in Jordan, there were several statements by the government saying that they were going to go along with some older World Bank recommendations to make sure that there's more security in private property, more security in contracts. They also tend to loosen and deregulate trade, so to allow more free trade. And then one of the ones that seems to be the biggest and that is sort of harder to change in some times is the impact on monetary policy, to try to get sort of a more stable monetary policy, to get sort of predictable growth, to try to make sure that the economy grows to accommodate all these new people who need to find jobs in the labor market. I mean, this is one of the things when you dig into the Jordan example. The government in Jordan was very worried about a large number of people coming in the middle of a recession and not being employed, and that causing political instability. So it's not like it comes from an altruistic perspective of these governments. In many cases, these are programs or reforms that they were kind of toying with before, they were thinking about doing, but the sort of sudden shock and how this could cause political instability was really the incentive for them to sort of go through with a much more radical reform agenda than they had contemplated prior.
So Chris, if you want to react or weigh in based on your own research and you know,
Can I take us back to the
area?
dusty past a bit in reflection?
Absolutely.
Okay. So one thing I like that Alex mentioned is what we might think of as like migration as poverty relief a little bit, right? And I think if we go back to the 19th century, what we learn is migration can serve that role, but it's not particularly targeted in a sense that those who most need relief are too poor to migrate, right? So from a place from a desperately poor country in very tough circumstances, you get sort of the middle to the bottom third of the distribution, but not those who are most likely to starve in a famine, for example. So it can help, but it's kind of not enough, if you want to put it that way. The other thing I was thinking about this is the institutional stuff is really interesting because I don't know anything about it. So it's fascinating to listen to it. But we think about the classic labor market questions, right? Because Alex mentioned good old George Borjas. Do we think that migration has deleterious effects on wages in the places migrants go to? Okay. I think most of the evidence, most of the research has a really hard time finding strong negative effects anywhere. Certain skill groups may be a bit more touched than others, but you often have to scratch pretty hard to find anything very substantial. I think what's interesting about this is it kind of runs against your priors as an economist, right? You tend to think, well, immigration increases labor supply, therefore wages should fall, right? I think one of the things we've learned over the last 30 years of migration research is that you can't really model migration this way, right? That clearly there are some big demand side effects, okay? So whether it's like agglomeration economies, so think about 19th century America building up, you know, industrial cities with large production units. Think about a late 20th century economy with knowledge cities. Does immigration make sort of build those up, right? I don't think there's some evidence in the first, right, that I think is reasonably convincing, but I think we could still learn a bit more about that. Also, whether having, you know, this sort of, if migration brings people with all kinds of different ideas and backgrounds together, does this diversity have some productive benefits? It's really hard to pin that down, although people have been sort of talking about this idea for at least 20 years, I think, going back to Ed Lazier's, he's got this book chapter, about 20 years old now. So I think the important thing is it's not just, you know, Econ 101, supply curve shifts out, the story's over, right? And I think that's super interesting, right? And should make us rethink a little bit about what's the right type of economics for some of these like important social problems.
Yeah, and if I could just like add on to that, what's interesting is because everybody talks about wages and immigration, and that's where the vast majority of the research is. And in my opinion, I think Chris is absolutely right. Like it's kind of tapped out. We've done a lot. The results all basically cluster around zero. And that's that. There's some exceptions, but it's pretty small. But what's interesting is the market that immigrants tend to affect the most is the market for real estate. So Emmanuel Sayes has this interesting paper where he takes a look at sort of the increase in immigration, both in sudden sort of surges like the Mariel boat lift, which increased Miami's population by 7% over about 45 days in 1980, but also just sort of more general, sort of predictable migration. The general effect is like a 1% increase in the population due to immigration, basically raises the price of real estate by 1%. And that is basically 3 times larger than any of the general wage effects that you will find in the literature. And it's really an underexplored topic. And what's interesting is when you dig into a lot of the research by, say, Thomas Piketty in Capital about sort of the increase in shares of ownership of capital and capital returns, a lot of that is being driven by changes in the price of real estate. So to the extent that immigration has an impact on real estate is something that I think is underexplored and is very important. I know this is true in London and a lot of other cities around the world, but a lot of people are being priced out of, the price of real estate has gone up considerably. And a lot of people who could have afforded homes or flats or apartments in previous years are now finding it very difficult to do so. Now, there's a lot of factors here. There are building restrictions, development restrictions on the supply of homes that I think are important. But also, we shouldn't ignore the fact that immigrants are yes, increasing. The demand for these goods and for real estate is increasing due to immigration, and that's really an underexplored topic. That is something that I would love to see. I mean, I would love to devour more research on that.
Well, excellent. Thanks for that. So my last question, and it's one that you can't get wrong because it's just what you think may happen in future. So you can relax. I mean, certainly we've seen increasing restrictions on migration in many developed countries. And if you look at, whether it was the referendum on Brexit in the UK, or certainly the recent cycle of presidential elections in the United States, and obviously politics in other places, the notion of controlling national borders is an issue that has a lot of political salience. And then in the past year, we've certainly had a further raising of national borders related to health, right? So the pandemic, has really made it clear for all of us that healthcare is something that is insured and delivered at a national level, and the notion of restricting people coming into your society from outside the society who could be bringing the virus, all these sorts of things have led to a rise, a steep rise in borders. And I think many of us on this call today will have experienced a Europe where borders were virtually invisible to a Europe today where the borders are actually really, really high and hard to get over and impacting us in meaningful ways. And I guess I'm curious, what do you think comes next? In other words, are we going to have a continuation in the trend of really noticing borders more and more and further restrictions on migration? Or do you think that there are other factors that are going to kind of, move us maybe in the other direction? So Alex, maybe you can take that first.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about, so I guess this in terms of short run and the long run. In the short run, I'm pretty pessimistic. Not only the virus, but I think, COVID-19 restrictions, but also I think these restrictions are going to hang around longer than is efficient. They may already have hung around longer than is efficient because it gives an excuse for a lot of policymakers to do what they already wanted to do. And as we know, a lot of policy is sticky, so they might just keep it in effect a lot longer than they wanted. In addition to this, if you've all been following the news, there's sort of a large surge of immigrants along the US-Mexico border, many of them child migrants, due to a lot of the restrictions put in place by Trump and carried over by President Biden. And so that just gives more and more of an excuse for politicians to keep a lot of these restrictions in place. There's a lot of findings in political psychology where American voters and voters in the UK, Canada, and Australia are really against immigration when they think it causes chaos. They want the government to have control, and they want these perceptions of control. So the more chaos there is in terms of these sudden surges or to go back to sort of the Brexit example, fears in the United Kingdom about refugees from the Syrian civil war and the perceptions of sort of chaotic migrant problems in the European Union, I think caused a lot of voters to turn not only against sort of unlawful immigration, but also against the legal variety. Because when there's chaos, people get terrified. Now, the catch-22, of course, is I don't think the government can get control of immigration without significant liberalization, but they can't get significant liberalization without having control. So it's this really dangerous, it's just really tough catch-22 for policymakers to try to get out of it. And so it reminds me a bit of the arguments sort of for the GATT and the WTO of trying to limit sort of retaliation by trying to limit government's ability to close down trade by getting everybody sort of on the same page, by creating the legal rules and framework that kind of got around that. So that might be like the only way to get around it, to try to get back to a more liberal immigration regime going forward. But I also think this is part of a general trend of going against or trying to roll back certain portions of globalization. We've also seen an increase in tariffs and other trade barriers around the world, either founded on silly notions of like national security or retaliation for other countries. And this, I think, is part of that general trend. I think in the long run, though, the benefits to immigration are so large, to a liberal immigration are so large, and the problems that developed nations are going to be facing in terms of economics in the future, such as like a shrinking workforce and other demographic issues, are going to give a big impetus for governments to try to solve these problems through liberalized immigration at some point in the future. So long run optimist, short run pessimist.
I think I would probably agree with the headline on that. Yeah, that policy is sticky, right? And so as I was listening to Alex, I was thinking, what can we learn from the historical episode for this, if anything? So I guess one thing is, if we think about the introduction of restrictions coming into North America, starting in 1917, but much more in the early 1920s, there's a big shock that leads to discontinuity that stops migration anyway. We just had that, right? What else do we know about that period? Well, if we look at sort of countries' different immigration policies, it looks like there's connections between things like inequality and migration policy. So this shock hasn't like reduced inequality. If anything, it's probably increased it, the current crisis. If that turns out to be the case with a year or two more in the bank, you would think, I would expect that would make people a bit more unfriendly towards immigration. I guess the other thing we learned about immigration restrictions in the early 20th century is, how can I say this? Exposure to immigrants matter. Places with few migrants, this is evidence from the US and votes on the literacy test to restrict immigration in the first place. So representatives of locations with few migrants are quite relaxed about immigration. Representative places with many migrants are also quite relaxed about immigration. They're their constituents. It's the places in the middle, just enough migrants that you're aware, and you might be conscious of potential competition, but not so many that, you're kind of cool with it. I can put it that way. So again, I'm asking myself the question, do advanced Western countries today often have many places that fit in the middle? So not like London, but like, smaller towns and cities in Britain might be in that middle group where there's enough opposition to immigration, but not a strong constituency that supports it or feels completely indifferent to it. I think that's quite a speculative answer, but that might be one way to think about this.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, that's, I think, entirely correct. There's nothing I disagree with at all about that. In the U.S. Scenario, sort of the last 5 years or so, just to put a little bit more on that, that's exactly right. What's interesting is to take a look at the rate of increase in recent years in an immigrant population in an area. So it's like there are places in, say, like Wisconsin that went from 1% foreign born in 1990 to 5% in the year 2000. And 5% is low. That's low. That's about as low as the U.S. has ever been historically nationwide as a foreign-born population. But that's quite a large increase for people who are living in that area in a short period of time. I grew up in Southern California, and in 1994, there was a big freak out about immigration then, where the state had turned from the whitest state in the union in 1960 to being the most ethnically and racially diverse state by about 1990, due entirely to immigration. And the result was Americans voted in that state for rules to make it more difficult for immigrants to settle in California. But then 10, 15 years later, everyone's used to it. And so it's one of these things where you got to get over this hump. And this hump is where the danger is in terms of more restrictive policies. And that's unfortunately where most of the Western world and much of the developed world is right on this hump.
Well, good. Well, thank you. So now we're going to take questions from the audience, and there's a couple already. Again, if people have questions, if you could type them into the chat function in Zoom, and we'll take them. We'll take them as we go. First question from Gregory Salter: do you see a mobility difference between those that were recruited by the destination country, i.e., the Windrush generation, for example, versus those that took the initiative themselves to migrate? And then as a follow-on, do refugee communities model differently? So I don't
Alex,
know
do
who
you
would
want me
like
to
to
start on
take that
this?
first. Here, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm sort of interested in this right now. Again, historical stuff, right? But I think there's pretty good evidence that immigrants who, like pioneer migrants, if you want to put it that way, who don't have a network in the place they go to, do have different outcomes, let's say, than those who migrate to a place where they already have an extensive network. Okay, so I think this is answering the question. So you do get differences. So that I think would also carry over to whether you're recruited or whether someone picked up to like go in the first place. Okay, now those things might also correlate with other things that affect how immigrants get on the economy. But I know if you look at similar in historical evidence, if you look at migrants who look similar on paper, right, or on your computer screen, we've turned it to that. Those who don't have a network, they look like they're selected a bit differently, right? It's pretty clear in who they are, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that matters a lot. I mean, just to sort of expand on that a little bit. I mean, refugees typically do start sort of at a little lower bar, all else considered, for the network effects that Chris talked about. And also there's tend to be there's not the self-selection so much process that you get from sort of, I guess I'll call it like normal economic or family migration. It's sort of a different selection process. But one of the interesting things is when they settle in their destination countries, they don't have the option to return to their home country. So that does change the incentives for them a little bit, whereas a lot of economic migrants do return to their home countries. I believe a lot of the evidence from Italians to the United States is that, roughly half or so returned back to their home countries. About different countries, different percentages at different times, but fairly substantial returns. But for refugees, that's not really an option for them. So what's interesting is you see different patterns of investment in country-specific human capital. So for like studying Vietnamese refugees in the United States post, the conquest of South Vietnam by North Vietnam, you've seen much more investment in education, English language immediately after arriving, rather than usually a little bit later. So you see this sort of, you take a look at the household, you model the household as a firm, or as an economic unit, you will see situations where the one spouse will work 80, 90 hours, support the family. The other one will take classes part-time to either earn a license or a certification or to learn English. So you see a lot more of that sort of right off the bat. There are also interesting issues of access to public benefits that change some differences of that affect behavior in destination countries. So there's a little bit of research taking a look at Russian refugees in the United States and where they settled, because in the United States, different states have different levels of access to public benefits and means-tested welfare programs. And those have other effects on, say, labor force participation right off the bat. So, and the fact that it might sort of lower labor force participation, at least initially. So all these things sort of had long-term effects So when you take a look at these different American states where refugees settled, there tends to be, at least for the Russian refugees that arrived in the 80s and early 90s, a little bit faster integration and assimilation to American wages. And then there's a whole battery of results taking a look at, say, like mental health outcomes, how much do they feel like they're at home in a new country, because it's quite traumatic for a lot of refugees, of course, to be separated from their home country, oftentimes in violence, brutality, than themselves, mostly a lot of times perfectly suffering. So there's a whole like trauma element as well that is typically not as present when it comes to economic migrants.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Alex. Let's take a question from Leo Lucassen. What about the emptying out of African/developing countries arguments from Collier's Exodus book? And linked to this, could you say something about the role of welfare states that, according to some like George Borjas, stimulate negative selection of migrants?
Sure. So, this Lant Pritchett called this sort of the ghost country effect, right? Like if there were free migration, there are probably some countries in the world where virtually everybody would leave. I mean, I think almost all of Haiti would come to Florida in pretty short order, from the poorest country of the Western Hemisphere to, I guess, the second wealthiest in terms of per capita income, right behind Canada. So I think they would all basically come in very short order. And there are some other countries where that's probably the case as well, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I ask, what's the problem? I mean, from a perspective of, the purpose of having high incomes and being wealthy is that it increases human welfare, human options, human choices, human lifespans, all these things. So like the average amount of wealth within some certain geographical area is not that interesting to me. What's interesting is the wealth and income that people have access to. So if they're able to move and grow out of poverty that way, then that is, for a lot of those people who are able to move, which it's not everybody, right? The poorest people are not able to, then that's a good thing to the extent that happens. So I'm not too worried about that. And what's interesting is there is some research on this, and it goes both ways, by the way. There's a recent paper published about this that the author, I'm forgetting it, but it's sort of the migrants who go to a new country and then they transmit back to that home country remittances, so money that can be invested in capital goods. They also send back different sort of cultural norms, different expectations about what the government should be doing in these places. So there's some evidence that this has improved some institutions and cultural characteristics in some developing countries that have sent a lot of these folks. Some evidence that it's done the opposite, but most of it seems to be that there's an improvement in that. So that's one effect. And then the other one is sort of this brain drain, right? What if everybody from, say, Zambia, to use the example of a fairly, poor country, who has a college degree or above, left and went to the United Kingdom, right? Like that would probably make Zambia a less productive country. Of course, the effect of this also is that it gives an incentive for Zambians to get that higher education that otherwise might not pay very well in Zambia, because the opportunity of leaving creates so much more, potential returns on that investment. So there's some recent research about nurses in the Philippines and taking a look at this, and the incentive to be able to come to the United States and work as a nurse has greatly increased the supply of nurses, people who go to nursing school in the Philippines. And the direct effect is actually that not all of them move. And it actually has resulted in an increased supply of nurses even in the Philippines. So on the flip side, there's a lot of dynamic effects here. It's difficult to model, but there seems to be some evidence that it might actually increase, say, the stock of human capital in countries that send immigrants. So I'm not so worried about that effect.
So I remember the Borjas Welfare Magnates paper. I think California being on the border with Mexico is really important, I think, in understanding why the results in that paper are a bit the way they are, in my kind of view. But I think it is an interesting question. And I think also one thing we do know, I think Alex will back me up on this, is that immigrants use welfare systems less than demographically similar native-born residents, whether you're looking at the UK or Britain or elsewhere. So in terms of the I don't like using the word drain, but in terms of the weight they might bear in the destination, it's not as large as some might put forward. But I really like the point Alex is making about the sort of pros and cons of a brain drain And this question about like education for export, Canadian economic historians have asked this question in the context of 1900, that did more Canadians go to school because the US paid higher wages, and that was a good way to move up by going south. So.
And I suppose I should say something about welfare. I've done so much research on that over the years. But yeah, Chris's characterization of sort of use of welfare benefits by migrants is entirely correct. I mean, it's like you can in some Western countries live entirely on benefits, but you can usually make more money working. And the types of people who self-select into this are typically of the type who want to sort of maximize their income in their new destination countries, because it is very costly to move. You know, cultural costs, being away from your family, the cost of a plane ticket, et cetera, being in unfamiliar environments. But on top of that, there are rules and restrictions on new immigrants' access to these benefits in the United States that are quite stringent. So if you're here on a temporary worker visa, you don't have any access to means-tested welfare benefits, with very few and very exceptions that are very cheap exceptions. And so it's one of these, and you can't really get them for the first 5 years that you're here if you're here on a green card, which is sort of the path to lawful permanent residency and eventual citizenship. So there are all these rules also where, you know, we might take a look at the welfare state and in these countries and think of like, well, natives can get these benefits just as long as they're poor or they're elderly, et cetera. But there's actually a large number of restrictions on obtaining them if you are not a citizen in most of these countries that place an additional barrier. So it's not like it's very feasible for an immigrant, just to use an example, right, from Mexico, to take a look at welfare benefits in, say, California and be like, I can go there and live off the dole, because like all the legal barriers to doing that are actually quite substantial and high, even in a state, even in a state like California.
Right, excellent. Well, Steve, I know you're on the call, and I think they answered the next your question. But if not, please type something in, and we'll make sure we'll respond to it. Here's a question from Michael Wallen. Given this kind of heterogeneity, how should we think about the average effects of immigration? It sounds like the immigrant skills, number of immigrants let in at a time, total number of immigrants in the area, and the country's overall economic situation would have huge effects.
So I can take a first stab at that. It's absolutely important to consider heterogeneity. And you can do that in a number of different ways. You can do it by geographical areas. So you can take a look at, say, MSAs or states in the United States, or MSAs in the UK or Europe, or other places to take a look at that. You can take a look at it by education, by occupation, by whether they're refugees or humanitarian immigrants or sort of economic migrants. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice this, and there's a lot of good examination of these research on either the labor market as well as sort of cultural integration and crime. There's a lot of research on this. The other dimension, of course, is legal status. Whether somebody is an unlawful immigrant or whether they're a legal immigrant matters considerably for a lot of these, often in surprising ways. But one of the great places to take a look at this is actually on the US state level. So if you're really interested in sort of digging in to a lot of these sort of heterogeneous effects, you know, I encourage you to take a look at the sort of US state level, because you got sort of 50 laboratories of democracy, to use a tired cliche, but where you have sort of a lot of different policies on the ground and immigrants going to very different areas in the country based on skill, based on occupation, based on economics. And one of the things that, of course, is difficult that we haven't raised yet is sort of the issue of endogeneity. You know, right? Like, immigrants choose where to go. They usually choose to go to places that are doing pretty well, where there's a lot of opportunities. So then teasing out, and then these places tend to do well after immigrants arrive. So to what extent are the immigrants affecting that is always a question to try to answer. I mean, there's a whole range of instruments, like the Bardic instrument for instrumental variables. There's tools now for like synthetic controls to take a look at some of this. But you really, you know, if you can find that quasi-natural experiment to take a look at that, to try to get into these heterogeneity issues, you're going to make a splash.
So this is a really good question from another former LSE student. haven't seen for a while either, so that's great. So I guess my reflection on this is, like, if you look at the literature on the returns to education, you really see this heterogeneity in the returns based on the type of schooling, the context you look at, you know, an extra year of university versus an extra year of secondary schooling. In the immigration literature, it's quite surprising to me, just thinking about what Alex was saying, how little variation there is. It's like so many of the results cluster really close to zero, right? So I think, to me, the surprising thing is how little variation there is in the findings. And so I think that's, if I hadn't seen any of the research, I would worry a lot about this. But having looked at this for about a decade, it's quite surprising how similar the findings are compared to other literatures where, looking at different contexts, you see really big differences in the return to education, for example. It's a really good question, though. I agree.
Yeah, it's great. And one thing I forgot is, right, like taking a look at superstar markets, markets where basically workers capture almost 100% of the increase in the value of that they supply, or a very large percentage of the increase in the value that they supply. You do see sort of a lot of immigrants concentrated in a lot of these industries. So as founders of firms, as entrepreneurs, in a lot of the technology space, you see a lot of people in there. So that's sort of just a very interesting result that I think bears a lot more, could bear a lot more research.
Can I say just one more thing about this?
Absolutely, yep.
Which is the fact that the findings concentrate so much on immigration having little effect. I don't think there's heterogeneity there, but I think the reasons why that is between the 19th century and the 20th century might be quite different. So I think the mechanisms that get you to a similar set of results might actually be quite different. That I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head here, but I think there are some differences that'd be interesting to understand a bit more.
Oh, excellent. Good. Well, here's a question from Christian Dennison. Is it possible to say anything about people trafficking within immigration? How significant is it? Is there any data available?
Not really. To put it bluntly, not really. And the problem is, because one of the big problems is that because so much migration today is unlawful, a lot of people are voluntarily, they're being smuggled, they're being trafficked. But it's not like when we think of human trafficking, and I think most of us immediately jump to thinking about slavery or involuntary migration or something awful that is a horrible human rights abuse and a crime that should be stamped out wherever possible. But in a lot of these cases, you have people who voluntarily go. And so separating that from the very serious problem of slavery and human trafficking is a challenge. And that's something that's very difficult to wrap your head around. I mean, there's been a lot of reports put out over the years about smuggling prices on the US Southwest border, basically increasing from somewhere around $1,000 to be brought across in 1990 to now somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 across the border. And those prices have increased in tandem with the amount of hours spent by Border Patrol agents patrolling those borders. So there is a very real effect whereby greater enforcement of these rules has the perverse, unanticipated, and unexpected effect of increasing sort of the depth of black markets in trafficking. Gordon Hanson has done a lot of work on this over the years. So that's something where, unfortunately, because it's a black market, we don't know a whole lot about. It's difficult to measure. Difficult to get good data on it. But there are some people who have been trying to do this over the years. There are databases in the United States of the government trying to take a look at smuggling prices from around the world based on interviews of people they have arrested and other things that might be that I always try to mess around with every once in a while, try to take a look at. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for delving into that issue. But the long and the short of it is we can't say a whole lot about it because it's hard to say a lot of interesting things about black markets that are hard, with hard data.
Right. Good, thank you. Let's here's a question from Charlotte. Some Western European countries since the interwar period have seen migrant communities settle, and future generations have, quote, moved up the ladder, also thanks to educational institutions. But we still have seen discrimination based on their names, race, etc. until today. Has the educational institution as a tool for social mobility shown its limits for migrants now?
That's a really hard question, and I am not going to pretend that I have a good answer. So I'm sorry, but you've prompted me to want to take a look at it on my own.
Yeah. I'm reading the chat here and trying to think if I want to say something about this, what I could say about it. I mean, one thing that's worth thinking about in this, I'm not sure this is answering the question, but let me start saying this, and we can do some ping pong back and forth if it helps with Charlotte. When we talk about immigrant integration, particularly when we're thinking about like differences in wage gaps and how they change or not, there is the question like, what about discrimination too? Right? So often the story often goes, well, if immigrant, non-immigrant pay differences, if the earnings of immigrants and non-immigrants converge, is that sort of integration and assimilation, or how much of it could be dissipation of discrimination as society becomes more accepting, okay? And you could argue, well, if there's a limit to how much convergence there is, how much of that is sort of residual discrimination, right? This is a really tricky one, right? Like in other contexts, we really put discrimination up front to explain earnings gaps, whereas when we look at immigration, that often doesn't even get mentioned in the research, which I always, when I talk about it with students, we often ask the question, well, how do you think about converging earnings profiles when there may be background discrimination, which is really hard to measure, right? And to separate from other processes. That may tell you more about society than education, I think. That's a good question.
Yeah, and Chris kind of knocked something loose in my brain with his answer. One of the things to take a look at, I think, in this is I'm not sure about the education answer. That's something to absolutely take a look at. Yeah. But taking a look at sort of the legal starting positions of a lot of these migrants, for instance, like unlawful migrants, whether they were unlawful, how long they were unlawfully present, and then seeing if there are some other characteristics that are important, but not as readily measurable as, say, education level. And there might be some sort of effects whereby the effect of like being initially in a country as a refugee or unlawfully could have effects even into the second generation by reducing, say, purchasing power of the initial generation, reducing resources in the home, etc. I mean, just to give you an example, right, of something that's interesting is the Iranian diaspora that fled after the revolution went to primarily the countries of Sweden, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. Mm. And there is some differences in these flows of people in terms of education, in terms of positions in these governments, but it's not massive. But what we see over time is just wildly different economic outcomes relative to the societies in which they've settled. And I think a lot of that has to do with the initial sort of legal circumstances, restrictions on their employment, restrictions on the production of human capital that might have sort of multi-generational effects. So that might be something worth looking into for specific groups of immigrants that went to several different countries at about the same time where there are different outcomes.
Okay, great. Well, at this point, we're happy to take any last questions that people have. Feel free to pop them into the chat. I guess one thing that strikes me, and I lived in Japan for a little bit earlier in my life, and when I think of countries that are aging, that are in some cases shrinking in population, and not just Japan, obviously. There are many countries that would fall into this category, including China, right, is certainly aging. Do you think that we'll see a, kind of a change in attitudes and policies as the, as the workforce really shifts, and the ratio of people not working to people working, and the need for workers in the society, is this something that you think will lead to, changes in attitudes and policies?
So I'll take it first, I guess. It depends what voters want from a migration policy. So if voters are very concerned about the long-term economic health of their societies and the funding of things like entitlement programs going forward, then I think that there will be a shift in terms of more support for these for migrants and for a liberal immigration policy. And I think there's going to be a point where policymakers in a lot of countries face that choice. Do we raise taxes by a lot, which voters really don't like? Or do we allow for more liberal immigration, which voters may not like very much, but they might dislike less than they dislike tax increases? So that's one possible choice. On the other hand, I like to say the good thing about democracy is it generally gives voters what they want. The bad thing is it generally gives voters what they want too. Because when they want things that don't make a lot of sense or are counterproductive for their goals, because it's really hard to think through sort of these social and economic impacts of changes in policy, then we get that too. So if voters in the United States, for instance, let's say the country starts to shrink in population for the first time in 60, 70 years, starts to age dramatically. If they're like, well, we're just going to decline, and because we dislike immigrants so much that we just don't want to let any in, then, no politician is going to want to liberalize immigration because that is against his own self-interest, right? So I guess it really depends on narrowing down and focusing on why it is that people have the opinions about immigration that they do. And that's something where there's massive disagreement. I have a few small opinions about it, but it's such massive disagreement, and the evidence is enormous for basically every theory there. So I would hope that's the reaction, but knowing what I know about public opinion and how different actions are incentivized by policymakers, I would like to be more optimistic. Let me put it that way.
Okay, let's take a question from Eugene. Is there anything that you can say about different outcomes for immigrants, refugees in the various countries that they went to? This goes back to your prior answer. I.e., do Syrian refugees in Germany do better than Syrian refugees in Sweden?
Do you want to try that first, Chris? Or
I'm trying to remember what I think the answer is yes. Isn't there variation how immigrants get on depending on the policy of the receiving countries? I haven't looked at this for about 5 years, but that was my sense when I used to teach, when last taught the migration course.
Yeah,
So,
there is a lot of evidence of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not hard to think about the kind of policies that would matter. Like, do you provide subsidized language training or not really, right? Like, that's a big difference between countries, right? So, if you look at Scandinavia and Israel, for example, I think that's quite comprehensive. Other places, not clear it's provide. I'm thinking about Quebec here, for example. So I think it's less systematic language training for those who turn up. So that'd be one obvious reason why you get differences. The language is a big thing, right? Then the other one is like, what are your restrictions on the ability to work when you arrive, right? Because building up that, like, what economists call host country specific human capital, like, that's pretty important. And the more easily that you can do it, the less you're like tied to a particular employer, for example. Like, I think that can make a big difference in the sort of adjustment process. And again, I don't have the policy differences on my fingertips for the 21st century, but there are, like, what refugees' right to work varies quite a bit around Europe, without having the facts in front of me. And that plus, you know, language adjustment and training, those seem to be really big factors.
Yeah, there's this good paper published in American Economic Review in 2019 that took a look at Switzerland. And it has a component about the labor market effect, but it's more concerned with the criminal effect. So in cantons in Switzerland, and this is a paper called the Violent Legacy of Conflict by Coutinier et al. Sorry, I'm butchering his name. But it takes a look at the different cantons have very different labor market policies for new refugees. And what they find, and then as a result of that, they have sort of knock-on effects later on about crime. And what they find is that a lot of these migrants from countries where they have fled conflict are more likely to engage in violent crime in Switzerland, but in the cantons where they get very early labor market access, that's the thing that matters the most, and that reduces the crime effect by 2/3. So it's one of these things where, like Chris said, in many European countries, and it's changed a bit since the migrant crisis, but in many of them, migrants, asylum seekers are not allowed to work for a period of years, sort of under protectionist labor market policies. But in those where, in these places like in Switzerland, some of these cantons where they can, it seems to have a pretty good effect on at least reducing that negative externality of migration, which is, in some cases, crime.
Well, good. Well, we have a couple of last questions on education, and Leo, maybe if you can, maybe pop off mute, and maybe if you want to phrase your question directly, that might be best. Oh, we're not hearing you very well, unfortunately.
Is this better? Does this
Yes.
work? Okay. No, it was more a reaction to Christian's question about the effects of Charlotte's question about whether education still has this this upward social mobility effect. And I think if I look at the Netherlands, and there's a lot of monitoring of second generation migrants in the Netherlands going on each year. And what you see there is, yes, it still does. It still has this effect, and very strongly also. If you look, for example, at children of Moroccans and Turks who were selected on very low skills and let's say settled in the Netherlands at a very unlucky moment at the beginning of a recession in the 1980s. If you see what happened to them over the last decades, they're really, really doing very well, much better than their peers, let's say the native children who come from the same socioeconomic background. So there's a selection effect, I think, also from sort of the more adventurous types who chose to migrate. There is indeed a problem with then translating that into a job. And then the discrimination does play a role, especially Islamophobia in the Netherlands. But at the same time, you also see them advancing in the job market and in the system as a whole, which also has to do with a quite tight labor market over the last 10 years or so. So I don't think that the system is broken in that sense. And as for the children of refugees and Iranians that Alex mentioned, also some 60,000 went to the Netherlands. And now you see that their children are even outperforming native children, even if you don't control for socioeconomic background. So there you see that the parents, yes, they had the shitty jobs, but they really, let's say, invested in their children and said, you should, I mean, it's a classical immigrant story there. So it still seems to work.
I mean, one of the things to bring up too is there's big differences in receiving countries across the OECD in terms of the immigrant employment and labor force participation rate relative to natives in these different countries. So typically the United States, immigrants have a higher labor force participation rate and higher employment rates than natives. I mean, it changes a few years here and there, but that's generally the case. In a lot of Western European countries, it's generally sort of below the native. So I think it's worth also asking what other country-specific labor market rules and regulations have an impact and where they have an impact. And I think there's some evidence, Justin Wolfers has an old paper, I think from around 2000, where he took a look at sort of the unemployment effects of labor market regulations in some European countries, and it's quite substantial, especially for lower skilled workers. And there aren't too many workers who are lower skilled than a new migrant who doesn't speak the language, right? So we would expect a lot of the costs of these rules. There are benefits to these rules as well, but a lot of the costs will be disproportionately borne by the new migrants who don't have that country specific human capital yet. So if we're thinking about like what things should maybe change to help these folks in the first generation get a leg up, maybe allowing them to come into the labor market with sort of fewer rules or fewer restrictions, or just the lower the legal burden for them to do so, I think is a really great place to start.
Well, okay, good. I think we're gonna wrap it up then. So again, if we were in person, we could go have a drink and people could chat more with Chris and Alex, but unfortunately we can't do that yet, but hopefully soon, sometime soon this year, we'll be able to do it back in person. But just a big thank you to Alex and to Chris for agreeing to put themselves forward and on a topic that is that just is one of these timeless topics that is always generating interest and controversy. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a good evening.
Thanks to Tracy for bringing us together tonight as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
And thanks so much for the invitation from abroad.